Chapter 14. The Train. This was yet another of the remnants of the old Soviet military machine. It lay deep inside a large oblong cutting, the top of which was surrounded by a crumbling brick wall and razor wire. The buildings were already starting to break up, and there was a strong, sinister sense of long-gone power about the place. It had obviously once been somewhere of tremendous strategic importance. You could tell that by the types of structures and the strongly constructed platforms, together with now rusting stubby cranes. Bond lay in a gap in the wall, on top of the cutting, looking down on the panorama below him. The T-55 stood at the end of the deep ruts it had made when climbing up the high sloping grass embankment, and he was relieved that he appeared to have arrived before Ourumov. That had not been difficult, for the car in which the general travelled with Natalia was forced to take normal roads, while the tank had been able to move away from streets, so slew off across open fields to get to this place. Bond silently thanked Jack Wade for pointing it out to him on their long drive around on the day of his arrival in St. Petersburg. Later, when the gangster arms dealer Zhukovsky had mentioned the rumors that Janus traveled in style on an armored train, Bond had known immediately where the train was likely to be kept. Here, the once #1 strategic rail weapons depot. The first real proof of what this place had been was in the number of long, strengthened flatbed trucks, which had been the main transporter vehicles for NATO-coded scapegoats. Savage, Sego, and Scrooge nuclear weapons. The ICBMs and tactical nukes, which were taken by rail to sites and silos, or even intended to be launched from these very tracks. The track itself appeared to be in good order, as did the one train standing in the depot. A large diesel-powered, heavily armoured engine was set to pull 3 carriages. Each seemed identical and was also armoured. The engine was already running at idle, and from its square nose a single, long, telescopic steel buffer projected. At its foremost end was a circular plate, almost the same circumference as the front plate of the engine itself. The buffer, he thought, would be enough to deter anyone attempting to get in the way of the engine. It would also act as an effective shock absorber should such an engine be pulling a nuclear load. He was thinking that the entire train had been well refurbished when the car swept out of an underground tunnel to screech to a halt beside the platform. He would make sure they were on board before he moved off, for it would take him longer than 10 minutes to travel below the ridge of the cutting, then down to the point where he planned, once again, to come face to face with Janus. Ourumov dragged the girl from the back and turned to the driver. Natalia cowered behind the general. "Shall I wait, sir?" the driver asked. Ourumov nodded. "If you would. Wait forever, please." He shot him, twice in the stomach, then once through the head, the coup de grace, as he lay dying on the ground. Revolted, Natalia turned away, then jumped backwards in surprise, for Xenia Onatop had silently come from the train and was standing directly behind her. "Welcome, Natalia." She gave a wolfish smile and wiggled her hips slightly. She wore a skin-tight one-piece black jumpsuit and highly polished calf-length boots. An Uzi hung from her shoulder. "Arkady." She leaned forward and kissed the general. "It's wonderful to see you both here safely. Janus is going to be so pleased." "Not with what I've got to tell him." Ourumov sounded surly. "Never mind. Such romps we'll all have. And think of that wonderful son. Come, little one. She looked at Natalia as though she could eat her. As they half pulled Natalia towards the train, Ourumov seemed to throw off his surliness. I shall enjoy a little sunshine after the winter we've had. Then he laughed, an unpleasant cackle. Natalia, you'll be fine sport. I know you'll have fun. Xenia is an extraordinary woman. She likes anything with legs. Rather exotic tastes our Xenia has. Yes. Natalia found, on boarding the train, that it did not smell as she expected a train to smell, even a diesel. There was none of that mixture of sweat, oil, and grease she was used to. Instead, she smelled flowers, roses. The air was sweet with them. When they took her into Alec Trevelyan's carriage, she gasped at the opulence. She had seen photographs of Tsar Nicholas's train, with its rich hangings, chandeliers, beautifully upholstered seats, fine mahogany panelling, and polished tables. This seemed to be a replica. Trevelyan sat at one of the tables which was laid out for breakfast. There was the other thing Natalia could smell, fresh and rich coffee. The china on the breakfast table was nothing like she had ever seen. Each cup, saucer, and plate was ringed with a thin gold band, sandwiched between two royal blue bands, while each piece also contained what seemed to be a royal crest, a blue shield on which there were two gold profiles, as though a face had been split in two. Like the man sitting drinking his coffee, the right side clear and unharmed, his left side scarred and terrible, with the eye socket pulled down out of alignment, and the mouth frozen at the corner. Between eye and mouth, the ruined flesh seemed like the skin of a reptile. As he stared at her, Natalia felt movement. The train was beginning its journey, swaying slightly and gathering speed. The man with the disfigured face, whom she took to be Janus, glanced at Ourumov, and then his eyes switched to Natalia, looking her slowly up and down so that she felt he was mentally undressing her. It was a humiliating experience, and for the first time this went on, she felt as though this strange man really had the power to see her body through her clothes. She would not look him in the eye, turning away her head in embarrassment. Finally, he spoke to Ourumov. Either you've brought me this perfect gift for our long journey, General, or you've made me a very unhappy man. Ourumov gave a shrug, as though nothing mattered either way. That idiot Mishkin got to them before I could. What you're really trying to tell me is that Bond is alive. Another shrug. He escaped. The scaly and askew side of his face seemed to give a twitch. Good for Bond, he murmured, then lifting his head. But bad for you, General. Xenia gave an unpleasant, croaking laugh. I told you that if I couldn't get this man Bond, then you wouldn't have any success either. Taunting the General. Trevelyan shook his head. Bond has as many spare lives as a cat. Now, bring her over here. He motioned towards Natalia. Ourumov put a hand on her shoulder and propelled her roughly towards Janus Trevelyan, thrusting her down in the padded chair next to him. Just sit quietly and be a good girl. Trevelyan spoke softly, and she noticed that he had a very similar accent to that of Bond. When he leaned forward, his face close to hers, she wanted to pull away. It was not the disfigurement as much as something about the man's personality. Not just unpleasant, but bordering on evil. "You like my friend James?" he asked. She gave a non-committal nod, just the slightest movement of her head. "Well, my dear, James and I shared everything at one time." When he smiled, it was only with the right side of his mouth, and the left eye seemed to close, its reptilian eyelid sliding down very slowly. The eye reminded her of a lizard or a chameleon. As he came even closer, she smelled a cologne and coffee, but something else. For a second, she could not place it, but then realized that it was the smell of burning flesh, and she did not know whether she was imagining this or not. Someone had once told her that when it rained in Berlin, you could still smell the burning of that city. The hint of how it had smelled after countless bombings and the final bombardment that had taken place 50 years ago during the war. He must have sensed that she was trying to pull back from him. "We shared absolutely everything, and you must understand that to the victor go the spoils. You can make your life very pleasant. You can even live life in luxury for some time. Eventually you will come to like me very much." His lips brushed her neck. Then he moved a hand, turning her face, lowering his lips to her mouth. She allowed him to get close. Then, like an unpredictable animal, she opened her mouth and snapped at his lip. She felt her teeth going in and saw, as he pulled back with a little cry of annoyance, that she had broken the skin. Blood was running from the lip. She did not see his hand come up to slap her hard, only the feeling of a sting of sudden pain as her head was pushed sideways. "You bastard!" She spat at him. "I like a spirited woman." He gave his warped smile again. "A woman with your kind of liveliness is much more fun than some docile bitch who just lies there like a pillow. I shall enjoy breaking you, Natalia Fyodorova." Her eyes opened with a surprise. "How do you know my name?" The smile again, this time broader and therefore more sinister. "You'd be surprised at what I know." As he moved towards her again, there was a sudden shrill, piercing alarm, which seemed to surround them like some tangible envelope. She also saw red lights blinking on the roof of the carriage. He pushed her roughly out of the way and spoke to Ourumov, telling him to stay and watch her. Then he was running fast towards the next carriage, Xenia, with the little Uzi at the ready, following him. In the short time Bond had available, he had chosen the best possible point for his ambush on a mile length of straight railway track, leading into a short tunnel. The tank had nearly upended itself as he went down the embankment, close to the place he wanted to use. But finally, he maneuvered the machine into position, lining up its tracks on the rails so that it faced in the direction from which Trevelyan's armored train would come. He opened the hatch, climbed into the gunner's seat, and examined the shells in their racks. The T-55 carried 3 types of shell for the 100mm gun: smoke, high explosive, and armor-piercing. Bond did not have to think twice. The gun was easy enough to load, and with the engine at idle, he could swing the turret and depress the barrel so that it was pointing directly at where the train would appear. It was yet another calculated risk, for Trevelyan might easily play things safe and back up as soon as the tank was spotted, a move that could quickly take the train out of range. He was also gambling on Natalia being held somewhere in the rear of the carriages. He would only have one chance, one shell to take out the engine, and almost as soon as he had depressed the firing button, it would be necessary for him to be up and away through the hatch. Strangely, the only thing worrying him was the very small amount of ammunition in the machine pistol. He thought it would now be about 6 rounds, which were not enough to take out Trevelyan and his lieutenants. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. The biblical quote came back to him, together with familiar scents from the past, the smell of chalk and other boys, of damp grey flannel and the harsh penalties for flouting rules. Pressing his eye to the forward sight, he saw that the train had already begun to move swiftly into view. Trevelyan and Xenia had moved forward into the communications carriage, filled with state-of-the-art computers and communications electronics, which would keep them in touch with the entire world if need be. At the far end, a monitor linked them with a camera set high at the front of the engine. When he saw the tank, stationary on the rails ahead as they closed fast, Trevelyan uncharacteristically sighed, then made a noise which mingled anger with a hint of admiration. "Only James Bond," he muttered. "He'll derail us! We must stop!" Xenia showed some panic in her usually calm and cool manner. "No!" from Trevelyan. "What do we do?" The question came from up front in the train's cabin, and it was obvious that the driver and his engineer were already slowing slightly. The brakes had started to pump. "Stop that!" Trevelyan had snatched at a small microphone attached to the wall. "Go for him! Full speed! Ram him!" "But," came the driver's voice, "ram him, damn you! You have that damned great battering ram up front. Now's the time to use it." The words and confidence were easy, but the situation had certain very dangerous drawbacks. Trevelyan had experienced enough to know what was going on. He too was a gambler. Whatever happened now, he thought, the train would be wrecked. Well, that was okay, for he would have no difficulty finding an alternative method of transport. It was an irritation, a minor setback, but they would still get to their destination. He looked up at the monitor and braced himself in his seat. Opposite him, Xenia was also straining backwards in her seat, the Uzi held across her lap and her legs straight. Above them, the monitor showed that they were rushing towards the tank at high speed. About 600 yards to go and closing very fast. At around 200 yards, Trevelyan began to feel the first nip of fear in the back of his mind. Then there was a flash, followed by a great heaving, as though the carriage were being shaken by an earthquake. Bond had banged down on the firing button. The turret bucked under the recoil, and the shell penetrated the front of the engine, exploding with a sheer gout of flame which seemed to reach out as though trying to devour the tank. He pulled himself up through the hatch, leaped to the left, and rolled away towards the bank, almost at the moment the train's engine hit the tank, the long telescopic buffer buckling under the impact. Bond dug himself into the earth as the forward momentum of the engine pushed the tank, now on fire, back into the tunnel. Then came the second explosion, a thunderous clap of noise and a searing heat which even Bond felt, lying on the ground a good distance away. He raised his head and saw the wide plume of flame and smoke coming from inside the tunnel, the mixture of fuel and explosives rising into the air, as though drawing a deadly question mark. By the time that happened, Bond was on his feet, the machine pistol in his hand, running full tilt towards the carriages, looking for the easiest way in. He saw the steps at the door linking the last and middle carriages, and threw himself towards them, his hand touching hot metal, his heart set on finishing this business with Trevelyan once and for all. In the communications carriage, both Xenia and Trevelyan had been thrown to the ground. Equipment had detached itself from walls and desk tops. Xenia's Uzi had skittered back along the aisle, and worst of all, they were plunged into darkness. "Emergency generator!" Trevelyan shouted, and Xenia stumbled forward, feeling her way to the large wall switch which would give them power now that the engine had exploded, taking with it their normal source of electricity. She pulled down on the switch, and as the lights came on, "Just stay absolutely still." The voice came from behind them. Trevelyan, half sprawled across a table, did not even bother to look around. "James, why can't you just die like any other normal person?" he asked.